My talk is called On Pinning a Platform, and I work on the Pinterest API, so you can probably guess that I'll get into API. But in the meantime, I was kind of too busy setting up my laptop. Can I have another show of hands of how many of you use Pinterest at least 3 times a week? That's great. That actually lets me get into maybe the expository piece of my talk, which is maybe to share a little bit with you about what Pinterest is. It's not, you shouldn't think of Pinterest as a social network. In fact, what your friends do on Pinterest is probably less interesting than what you do for yourself. We call ourselves the world's catalog of ideas. What you're seeing scrolling by is the home feed, and it's based on personalization. So every pin or every of these things that appear is based on things that you do on the app, and it's personalized to you. Stuff that you saved, stuff that you liked, stuff that you explicitly followed. This is the obligatory lepidopterist slide, because all companies sort of have founding myths, and one of our founders loved collecting insects. And so the idea of collections was a big sort of founding piece of the idea of Pinterest. Just sort of like how you might stick a pin into a butterfly that you're interested in studying, you might stick a pin into your interest. The modalities of the app are sort of like discover, save, and do. Discovery is a little bit different than search, although we do offer search. You can search for things and you have a guided search experience. But discovery is when you kind of don't really know what you're looking for. Discovery is when you find things serendipitously based on some of the interests that you're exploring. It's a little bit like, I like to think of it as channel surfing for the internet. You're not going to watch that show, you might skip to that show and then you find something you like. Similarly, you might discover something you like, what to eat for dinner, what to wear, what kinds of places to go for vacation. And when you see something you like, you save it. And that's one of the big modalities of the app, is that you save things. And then, of course, you can take action. You can cook a recipe, or you can visit a place. And we also offer types of pins where you can buy things straight from the app. This is what my Pinterest account looks like. This is my profile. While I don't collect insects, I certainly make my own chocolate, which is something that I won't really talk about on social networks. It's like just a thing for me. I brew my own cacao. So that's part of my interest. And I've learned how to do it on Pinterest by following different chocolatiers. I also have a style pin board where I sort of pin things that I like. And so these are sort of the modalities of the app. This is the data set that we're working with. And now I can get into some of the discussion about what it means to build a platform around that, what it means to have an API story around that type of modality and that type of data. Of course, the word platform kind of maybe needs a little, you might want to know how I think of that. And so I thought, well, a quick slide showing some substrates would be good. Substrates, literally, the way I'm using it is, the base layer upon which an organism can grow. And there's a couple of things that we take for granted. If somebody said, hey, build a thing, build it soon and make it scale, I'd be like, okay, well, what kind of UI does that thing need? And you can probably see from this that I'm not a game developer, and if I left out your favorite thing, don't be too mad at me. This is really reductionist thinking. But you can take a few things for granted. For example, if any of you have used the design tool called Figma, has anybody used Figma? I like Figma working in browsers, and you can use it in a browser pretty reliably because of good HTML5 canvas support. That's part of the default platform. And they can deploy something based on using that as their substrate. So yeah, you kind of have the mobile layers. Pinterest is built on Amazon Web Services. So this is kind of the default tool set when you think of crafting something. I showed 4 browsers, but can anyone tell me how many distinct layout engines there are? There are 2 viable answers. Yes, that's either you can say 2, yep, there's only 2 differentiated browsers, or you can say 4, because they all have subtle differences. But basically, you expect it to be the same. And so, I used to work for Mozilla. I used to work on HTML5. I worked on the piece of HTML5 that touches the file system or the file API, and then I left, and I still get GitHub blamed for it. So I could have put GitHub on this, but now I work for Pinterest. So you know, funny story is probably tell people that you're no longer a module owner. But then we get into some of the interesting platforms. You climb much higher up from the substrates. You become the organism. And the good news is that there's been so much of this around that we can learn a little bit from history. They always say, don't reason from analogy. But it's kind of interesting to see what the other children brought to lunch. So Facebook had a lot of things, but now really Facebook identity is kind of part of the ecosystem. You log into a lot of apps using Facebook login. They have ads, of course. They have an ads API. They have a lot of stuff. They have Facebook likes. The Instagram API is mostly read-only, but it's a cool application API. Twitter had apps, and then they didn't have apps. But they have identity. And just like Facebook, you can log in with Twitter. And they certainly, of course, have an ads API. And of course, Google has a lot of things. They have an ads API. The Maps API is one of my favorite things. And so it's like, this is sort of this is what the other children brought to lunch, is the way I think about it. But you can learn from some of these things. You can learn that maybe you can distill some axioms for ad-supported platform APIs. Well, don't let your app get cannibalized, because then you might have to back something out. Prevent spam, prevent malicious hacks, and help advertisers and marketers be more efficient. Sure. But the interesting one is enable some consumer use cases off the app. So when somebody's personalized stuff on Pinterest and saves stuff, what kinds of things can you do for them off the app? What's interesting here? That's always a bonus, because the consumer-facing component of APIs might be retrenched a little bit, but it's always really interesting to think about, especially if it supports some of the advertising use cases. I think open access is desirable up to a point, but maybe some APIs are special, and you might want to give them to only certain partners on a whitelisted basis. And I think, of course, state-of-the-art has now become OAuth, maybe RESTful endpoints, some SDKs. Different APIs work differently, but this is generally kind of what I think is a viable set of axioms. And so, of course, now on to Pinterest. At Pinterest, we have an internal API that helps us build out our product as well. And usually, every new engineer at Pinterest, when they're getting oriented, they have to write an API endpoint in Python, and it's usually the Hello World API endpoint, and it brings back an array of greetings. Then there's an ads API that's actually on the same endpoint system as the internal API, but on a whitelisted basis to certain advertisers. They're called marketing developer partners. Here's a few marketing developer partners that have built against the Pinterest MDP API. And of course, then there's the public developer API for consumer use cases. And you might say, what kinds of use cases are valid? Like if the app was a castle and we lowered some drawbridges, what kinds of things, what kinds of data should go back and forth across those drawbridges? Well, Pinterest doesn't index the web. So all those pins come from pinners. And so a safe bet might be that the API could be a way to obtain content. That might be an interesting supposition. Personalization. You do a lot of things that are very personal on Pinterest. I'm a chocolatier. I pin some clothes. People plan vacations to Portugal and other places. What interesting things can happen in the world if you grant access to something to look at that? And of course, there's brand lift, which is the most interesting use case, which is the splashy aspect, the Mad Men aspect of advertising, where you try and do something really cool. And that thing that's really cool generates some hype, and maybe you get some brand lift. Basically, the Pinterest API, the developer API, is a way to read and write from Pinterest. Pins in, pins out. If PIPO isn't a thing, maybe it could be. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the folks that have built against the Pinterest API. Polyvore built against the Pinterest API. You connect Polyvore to your account. It's an app. It's also a website. Stuff you do on Polyvore, if you like something on Polyvore, it generates pins and boards. And so they're increasing organic traffic flow and getting earned media through integration with Pinterest. IFT, for those of you that use IFT, you can do an if this, then that integration with Pinterest. pretty much par for the course. Like with IFT, they've kind of got a little hook into just about everything, and you can string a lot of things together. But then it gets kind of interesting. You know, the obligatory code slide. Basically, you can see that this is what our SDK looks like and what people write stuff in. This is a JS SDK, but we also have an iOS SDK and an Android SDK. Pretty straightforward. This is actually one of the first interesting use cases that came across that use the Pinterest API, which is that Topshop, a UK retailer, integrated with Pinterest, and it would deduce from your habits on Pinterest what your color palette was. So it says, oh, you like a lot of gray things, or you like a lot of green things, and let's show you those kinds of clothes for you to clad yourself in. Paint company Valspar did the same thing, but applied it to paints. Give us a home improvement board. Let's take a look at what your home improvement tastes are. And let's suggest some paints that you can buy. So this was an interesting use case where Valspar made a microsite, asked for you to give us a pin, and from that pin it deduced stuff that you might want to paint your house this color, because you appear to like that. It appears to be what your personalization is like. Burberry set up something really interesting which gave us content to Pinterest. And so that's the most interesting case because Burberry bought some advertising, some promoted pins that took the pinner to an experience on Burberry's site. And from that, you could answer some quiz questions, particularly applied to makeup. How much time do you spend on your makeup? What kind of eyelash look do you like? And based on some of those answers, it created a custom board for you with unique pins. So that kind of unique pin or doing something on another site and then taking it back to Pinterest so you could look at it later and be inspired from it later and maybe look at some of the pins that Burberry created. That was an example of content coming into our system. Another good use of the API to increase the flow of content from your site or from your content repo to Pinterest. This was one of my favorite integrations with the Pinterest API that I personally had the most fun working on. For those of you that sort of know, Pinterest has this idea of a save button that you put on your website, and if you like something, you hit that save button, and it pushes the thing that you're saving to Pinterest. Talk and Stock in Brazil came up with this notion that, okay, why don't we make those pins real and stick it in a live retail space? So that as you're walking through a retail space, you could hit something that you liked. Walk past a chair or a table and say, oh, I like that. And it would connect with Bluetooth Low Energy to an app on your phone that connected to the Pinterest API and generated a pin. So it was like saving from a website, but in a live retail space. So those are some of the cool things that people have built using this. That's really what the Pinterest API story is. It's pretty new. And we're kind of always looking to see what people will build against it and what people will do with it. And so that's my talk to you folks. Any questions, I'm happy to take them.
All the use cases you just walked through, are those all able to be built through the public developer API, or are they part of the whitelisted API?
That's a great question. All the use cases that I talked through are through the public API. So you could build something like that pretty easily. The whitelisted API is really for ads and for advertisers. And I call that the MDP API or the ads API. MDP stands for Marketing Developer Partner. That's a good example. Those kinds of uses are really when a marketer is helping, or a platform is built for marketers to promote content or to buy ads or to do auction stuff and stuff like that. This is all this consumer stuff is from the public API.
For all the color-based examples you're showing, do y'all have like a color API?
Yes, that's a great question. So the color-based examples are accessing a field that's a hexadecimal representation of the color of the pin. Another way to do that is to actually look at the image of the pin and do image analysis on the actual pin. But this is taking a look at a field that's returned that's a hexadecimal encapsulation of the color. That's a good question. Yes, that's right. That's right. It's an aggregate of the pin's color.
Might come in your way.
More on the color. Is that the load color?
Say that again?
Is it the same color as the load color?
The load color, did you
Like
say?
if you have a slow load time, the color pops up before the pin generates?
Oh, that is a really good question.
I like those colors.
You like the load
color? Yes.
That's a good question. I don't know if it's equivalent to the load color, but that's likely to be the case.
Thanks. First of all, thank you, because Pinterest helped me to pick up those watches that I'm wearing now, the style of them. So thanks for that. Second
great.
of all, I wanted to ask if there is any, if your API has any feature that could help me recognize if, for example, I'm talking about fashion, and if your API, I can ask your API, okay, get me images of people with brown hair, blue eyes, whatever body type.
Okay, that's a good question. So, through visual search in the product, you can probably do that.
Oh, okay.
And I guess that will get better and better. But through an API, we haven't exposed that yet. So what you could do is find pins that match the image surface that's of interest to you, or you could actually match pins from your camera.
Basically, I would want to search for a certain body type on a photo. Like that's still the same.
Yes.
Okay.
That's still the same, because what you're doing there is probably matching based on image, and you're looking through image data and having images return that match that image.
Oh, yeah, okay, thank you.
Can I follow up that question? Sure. And this is sort of related to the API, but actually more has to do with your image recognition. Are you creating classifier sets? Because I know that you can actually specify within an image, even take portions of that image, and then do a visual search based off of that.
That's right, that's in the product.
Okay, and I mean, what is the sort of machine learning techniques going on behind the scenes, and is any of that actually exposed in the API?
So none of that is exposed in the API, and as for the actual machine learning technique, so if that was your original question, it isn't exposed in the API. But as to the actual machine learning techniques, I doubt that I could speak authoritatively enough to answer your question.
What's the coolest thing you've seen built that's like a hack or individuals?
The most interesting thing that I've seen come out so far is really when you get the color-based match, because it's actually eerily true. Because I was doing a home improvement project and I pinned a bunch of things, and it turns out I really like earth tones, and I didn't realize that I didn't think of myself as an earth tones liking person till I saw that it was assessing my images and saying, "Why don't you paint your house this color?" And I'm like, "Yeah, why don't I?"
Are there like material trends in color preference changes over time?
That's a great question. So we also have an internal data and insights team that is probably the best folks to answer that. I would hypothesize that the answer is probably yes. And in fact, some of the access tokens that the API can grant in the developer API allow you to retrieve pins over the course of time. Of course, you have to OAuth, and the pinner has to grant permission. But it is the kind of thing that could be built. Is, hey, look, your color prefs have changed over time, especially with respect to clothing. In New York, that's actually unlikely. Is another guess I have, but black versions of black and gray. But it's a likely projection that somebody could make.
Great. Time for maybe one more.
So, hi, I'm Xavier. Actually, just to follow up to your question, Dan. I was listening the other day to the Roman Mars podcast, and he mentioned that there's this company that actually companies hire this company to show them how to like build style guides. So if you guys have your data team with this earth tone idea of colors, I think they'd have a really good run with this idea of like, okay, here's your Pinterest for the last 3 years. Maybe you might like this next. How do we like ping them online?
So is the question is, you know of a group of people that are making a style guide?
They actually sell style guides to like, Burberry and Chanel. They sell style guides.
Yeah. And you suspect, or your idea is that they could integrate with this?
Yeah, definitely.
It sounds like a great integration.
All right. So who do I ping? How do I ping?
Oh, yeah. Developers.pinterest.com.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Developers.pinterest.com is where all of this is available. Also, if you remember, github.com/Pinterest. Good question, because it is probably the slide that I did not include, where to go after and where to find more information. Thank you for asking.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. That was awesome.